The first part of the lesson dealt with the SEC Act of 1933, which was mainly about the offering process. In other words, how companies were able to actually start offering their securities on the open market in the first place. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and move to the Securities and Exchanges Act of 1934, which regulates the actual trading of the securities. It regulates the securities exchanges themselves, brokers, and dealers who sell and buy in securities. And, of course, it calls for civil and or criminal liability for anybody who violates these SEC rules. And we're going to discuss a few of these selected rules. And the first one, probably the most all-encompassing one, is Rule 10b of the Securities and Exchanges Act of 1934, which prohibits the use of manipulative and deceptive devices in the purchase and sale of securities in contravention of the rules and regulations. This is extremely complex. It may seem pretty simple that you're not allowed to be manipulative, you're not allowed to be deceptive, but those terms are extremely vague and extremely broad. And there's reams and reams of regulations, SEC opinions, and case law on exactly what it means to be a manipulative and deceptive advice. And we're going to discuss some specific underlying rules that are passed based on this Rule 10b. Remember, Rule 10b is a statute. It's part of the SEC Act of 1934 that is currently in the United States Code. And then there are regulations. Regulations under the SEC Acts, which are passed by the Securities and Exchanges Commission, which are passed by the SEC, since it has the authority to pass regulations under the securities rules. And we're going to discuss some of those, and specifically we're going to look at Rule 10b-5. Rule 10b-5 is a regulation, not a statute. In other words, it was actually written by the SEC, but it is completely enforceable nonetheless. And what it does, what 10b-5 does, is it prohibits insider trading. Insider trading is, well, it prohibits more than insider trading, but let's focus on insider trading for a minute. Insider trading means when an insider makes a profit by personally purchasing the shares of a corporation prior to the release of favorable information, or by selling shares of the corporation prior to disclosure of unfavorable information. The proper price for a security would be, it wouldn't be fair, essentially, for somebody with insider knowledge of what's going on with the company to leverage that inside knowledge in order to make trades ahead of the open market. If I work for a big company and the company's stock value is trading at $50 a share, and I know that we're about to announce a major acquisition that's going to cause the stock price to go up, and I turn around and buy the stock beforehand, well, then I'm getting an unfair leg up on the market. I'm getting an unfair advantage over other people who would be considering investing in this security, because I have insider information, which allows me to know information that the general market doesn't. So that's considered not fair, and that is considered insider trading under Rule 10b-5 of the regulations that are passed under Rule 10b of the securities rules. First of all, what is an insider? Well, an insider is somebody who essentially works for the company, an officer, director, or employee of the company, a lawyer, accountant, or consultant, or somebody who is hired by the company to work for the company and therefore gets this information, or somebody who owes a fiduciary duty to the company, somebody who maybe is an independent contractor working with the company, an auditor for the company, somebody who, by virtue of their relationship to the company, has some sort of inside knowledge that the open market does not have access to yet. And this can also lead to quote-unquote tipper and tippee liability. A tip is, in this context, an illegal piece of information that is given by somebody that has insider knowledge to somebody else. The tipper is the person who discloses material non-public information, and the tippee is someone who receives material non-public information. A while back, many years ago, but still a while back, Martha Stewart, who was famous for having these cooking shows on TV and whatnot, she actually got arrested, and she actually spent some time in prison for insider trading. She was a tippee. The allegation, which eventually was proven and she was convicted, was that somebody with insider knowledge gave her information, and because that a company called Imclone, which she held stock in, was going to announce something negative, and because of that she got out ahead of the market and sold her stock. It wasn't for that much. I mean, it was for, I think, about $40,000, which is a lot of money, but to Martha Stewart, who's a multi-millionaire, it's really not as much money. But still, regardless of how much money you have, you're still not allowed to make a profit based on inside information. And because she was able to sell because she got a tip, this was considered insider trading, and she was actually sent to jail for a few months because of it. If somebody does violate the SEC Act of 1934, and we discussed insider trading, but there are many other rules that are also prohibited, many other actions that are also prohibited by the SEC Act of 1934, there are various remedies that are possible. There are private actions. In other words, other investors, or people who were hurt by this person who used insider information or used manipulative or fraudulent tactics, can file a lawsuit for whatever damages they suffered. And there are all sorts of other remedies a court can enforce. The SEC can enforce with a consent order, as we discussed before. They can order somebody to do something. They can get an injunction, which is a court ordering somebody to, let's say, not make a trade, seek a court order, insider trading sanctions, or even criminal penalties. And there are also these treble damages, 3 times profits, which are really separate from criminal penalties, so I'm going to separate them over here. But treble damages is something that people can be liable for if they violate the SEC Act of 1934, which essentially means they have to pay 3 times the value. It's a special penalty that's established based on that. There's also criminal liability, as we discussed before. And under a much more recent rule called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, this was passed in, I believe, 2002. Individuals can be fined up to $5 billion and imprisoned by up to 25 years, or corporations can be fined as well, for violations that constitute violations of the SEC Act of 1934. Now, Sarbanes-Oxley, or Sarbox as it's called, expanded government regulation of securities, but one of the things it did is it provided for these sorts of criminal penalties. A similar rule to insider trading, really a rule that's made to back up the insider trading rule, is Rule 16a, which is the short swing profit rule. The short swing profit rule is something that essentially allows the government to deny somebody profits who may have had insider information, even if it cannot actually be proven that they did. So Rule 16a defines any person who's executive officer, a director, or 10% shareholder as an insider. And what it says is that if one of these insiders makes a transaction of the company's stock within 6 months of something that causes a fluctuation in the stock, then essentially they have to give back their profits to the company. This is one of those things where even if you can't prove that they actually knew any information, the suspicion, if they made some sort of a major deal and this company's stock goes up and an insider had bought shares 3 months ago and then they turn around and sell them, well, then they basically have to give back their profits to the company. It's a mechanism by which sometimes you just simply can't prove that they had insider information. You can't prove that they engaged in insider trading. But in order to prevent that possibility, the law says that we're not even going to allow you to make profits within this short term because the suspicion is too high that you may have secretly had information that caused you to profit on the expense of the other investors. There are even state securities rules. State securities rules are not as comprehensive as federal securities rules, but they can increase the requirements of various companies in terms of the disclosures that they give to the investing public. But again, generally speaking, because the securities markets are traded in interstate commerce and are very comprehensively involved in interstate commerce, you're mostly talking about federal law when you talk about securities regulations. And finally, I want to quickly go over the securities markets. Now, a company that is traded in public doesn't necessarily have to be traded on the market. It could be traded over the counter, which is done privately and without an exchange. But what an exchange is, it is a place, or an online place, that facilitates the easy transfer of shares. These securities exchanges are very heavily regulated by the SEC and have to be proven by the SEC to allow people to exchange and to trade in their markets. Some examples include the New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, or the National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotation. These are all things that in the old days were actually done physically, at least not the NASDAQ, but the New York Stock Exchange in the old days, if you wanted, I guess in the old days, if you had 100 shares of Coca-Cola that you wanted to sell, you'd go down, you'd tell a broker, or somebody who had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange would come out onto the floor and say, I have 100 shares of Coca-Cola, anybody want to buy it? And then somebody from across the room would say, yeah, I want to buy it, and that's basically the way it would work. Now today everything is more automated. You don't have to, I guess people, they still do yell on the floor of the stock exchange. If you go for a tour, you can actually look down on the floor of the stock exchange during the day, and people are still yelling. I don't know exactly what they're yelling about, since everything can be done by computer, but I guess they figure out a way to yell anyway, reason to yell anyway. But the point is, these are methods by which which stocks are traded. Now, stocks can be traded without an exchange, but it's a lot easier, and the market is much is much more comprehensive when you're trading on an exchange than when you're trading over the counter.